Imagine celebrating someone's arrival in Britain with open arms, calling it a victory for human rights, only to discover days later that they've got a social media history that reads like a greatest hits compilation of extremism. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where today's episode could be titled, How to Create a PR Disaster in 3 Easy Steps. I'm your host, and we're diving into the absolute car crash that is Keir Starmer's latest controversy. The Prime Minister rolled out the red carpet for an Egyptian activist, called himself delighted about it, and then, whoops, turns out nobody bothered to check the bloke's Twitter history. Spoiler alert, it's not good. We're talking calls for violence, anti-Semitic rhetoric, and the level of hatred that makes your drunk uncle at Christmas dinner look positively diplomatic. Buckle up, because this one's a roller coaster. So let's set the scene. Alaa Abd El-Fattah, an Egyptian-British dual national and democracy activist, gets released from detention in Egypt after spending years behind bars. He's been held since 2019, sentenced to 5 years for spreading false news, which in authoritarian regimes usually means said something the government didn't like. UN investigators called his imprisonment a breach of international law. The previous Tory government lobbied for his release. Labour lobbied for his release. Everyone wanted this guy freed because he was being held by a repressive regime, and that's the kind of thing democracies are supposed to care about. Fair enough, right? Fighting for persecuted activists is exactly what we should be doing. The problem is, nobody apparently thought to do a quick Google search before throwing him a welcome party. On Boxing Day, while most of us were nursing our turkey comas and pretending to enjoy the Monopoly game that inevitably ends in family warfare, Keir Starmer took to social media to announce he was delighted that Abd El-Fattah had been reunited with his family in the UK. He called it a top priority, basked in the glow of a job well done, and probably thought this was a nice bit of positive press to end the year. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. Because within days, now deleted historic social media posts started emerging that showed Abd El-Fattah in a rather different light than the freedom-fighting democracy activist narrative suggested. We're talking about posts where he allegedly branded Britons dogs and monkeys. Not exactly the warm embrace of his host country you'd hope for from someone we've just campaigned to bring here. There were calls for Zionists to be killed, not criticized, not opposed, killed. There was advocacy for violence against police and expressions of hatred toward white people in general. Now, I don't know about you, but when someone's greatest hits include calling the people of the country that just fought for their freedom dogs and monkeys, that feels like it might be relevant information to have before the Prime Minister publicly celebrates their arrival. Just a thought. The kicker here is that apparently Starmer had no idea about any of this when he made his statement, which raises the obvious question, how? How does the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom publicly welcome someone without anyone in the entire governmental apparatus thinking to check whether this person has a problematic history? This isn't some random citizen arriving at Heathrow. This is someone whose release was described as a top priority for the government. You'd think that warrants at least a cursory background check, the kind of due diligence you do before hiring someone to walk your dog, let alone before the leader of the nation publicly endorses their arrival. Now, Robert Jenrick, who's apparently made it his life's mission lately to be a thorn in Labour's side, and honestly, he's doing a pretty good job of it, immediately called for Abd El-Fattah to be stripped of his British citizenship and deported. Jenrick didn't mince words either. He said if Starmer really was unaware that Abd El-Fattah was an extremist, he should immediately retract his comments and begin deportation proceedings. He pointed out that someone with anti-British, anti-Semitic, and homophobic views shouldn't be in the UK. And while you might roll your eyes at Jenrick's political opportunism, and let's be honest, there's plenty of that going on, he's not exactly wrong on this one, is he? Here's where it gets even more embarrassing for the government. Jenrick pointed out that Abd El-Fattah's views were well known. This isn't new information that just emerged from the depths of the internet. The European Parliament rescinded a Peace Prize nomination for him back in 2015 after discovering his extremist posts. 2015. That's nearly a decade ago. So when Jenrick says civil servants who withheld this information from ministers should be sacked, you can see his point. Either they knew and didn't tell anyone, which is gross negligence, or they didn't know, which suggests a level of incompetence that's genuinely alarming. Neither option reflects well on the system. Let's talk about those social media posts in more detail, because they're not just controversial, they're genuinely disturbing. The European Parliament found a tweet from 2012 where he called for the murder of Israelis, not Israeli government officials, not specific political figures, Israelis. That's not political criticism. That's incitement to violence against an entire national group. And this is the person successive UK governments have been lobbying to free. Now, you might argue that people's views can change over time, and that's fair. People do evolve. But there's a pretty big gap between I used to think pineapple on pizza was okay, but now I've matured, and I used to call for people to be murdered based on their nationality. That kind of evolution requires some pretty concrete evidence of change, and it doesn't appear anyone bothered to establish whether that had happened. The response from Jewish organizations has been swift and damning, and frankly, entirely justified. The Board of Deputies of British Jews said there was an urgent need to find out whether Abd El-Fattah still holds these views. They described his previous extremist and violent rhetoric as threatening to British Jews and the wider public, and they're absolutely right. They also pointed out that the cross-party campaign for his release and the warm government welcome demonstrate a broken system with an astonishing lack of due diligence. That's the polite way of saying, what on earth were you thinking? The Jewish Leadership Council went even further, and their statement hits hard. They said they were appalled by the effusive welcome Abd El-Fattah received, especially given recent anti-Semitic attacks in Manchester and at Australia's Bondi Beach. They noted the bitter irony that the Prime Minister recently promised to root out anti-Semitism while simultaneously expressing delight that someone who advocated for killing Zionists has arrived in the UK. That's not just a contradiction, that's a slap in the face to Jewish communities who already feel vulnerable. And their point about people hearing those words as a call to action isn't theoretical, it's based on actual recent attacks. When you're celebrating the arrival of someone with that kind of history while anti-Semitic violence is on the rise, the optics are catastrophic. Now let's be clear about what Abd El-Fattah represents in Egyptian politics, because context matters. He was a leading voice in the 2011 Arab Spring uprising. He stood up against an authoritarian regime. He went on hunger strikes behind bars. By all accounts, he suffered genuinely for his political beliefs and his push for democracy in Egypt. That's not nothing. That takes real courage, and it's why so many people across the political spectrum supported his release. The tragedy here is that someone who fought for democracy and freedom apparently holds views that are fundamentally incompatible with the democratic values of tolerance and equality. It's possible to be both a victim of oppression and someone who holds oppressive views toward others. Humans are complicated like that. But here's where the government's defense falls apart. The Foreign Office put out a statement saying Abd El-Fattah is a British citizen and it's been a long-standing priority to work for his release and reunite him with family. All true. They also said the government condemns his historic tweets and considers them abhorrent. Which is nice, but feels like closing the stable door after the horse is bolted, set fire to the stable, and posted about it on social media. You can't celebrate someone's arrival one day and condemn their views the next without looking either incompetent or insincere. Pick your poison. Neither tastes good. The phrase historic tweets is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that Foreign Office statement, isn't it? Historic tweets, like they're ancient artifacts from a bygone era, rather than statements that were problematic when they were written and remain problematic now. And notice there's no mention of whether Abd El-Fattah has renounced these views, apologized for them, or shown any indication that he's changed. Just, we condemn them, while simultaneously defending his right to be here because he's a British citizen, which technically is correct, but doesn't address the fundamental question of whether someone who's called for violence on British people and various other groups should be warmly welcomed by the Prime Minister. This whole situation highlights a massive problem with how we approach human rights campaigns. We get so focused on the persecution someone has faced that we forget to ask difficult questions about who they are and what they believe. Abd El-Fattah was persecuted by the Egyptian government. That's bad. That deserves condemnation and action. But that doesn't automatically make him a hero or someone whose arrival should be celebrated without qualification. Sometimes victims of one form of oppression hold oppressive views toward others. Sometimes people who fight for freedom in one context are deeply illiberal in others. Recognizing that complexity doesn't diminish the injustice they faced. It just means we need to be more careful about who we hold up as symbols. The due diligence failure here is staggering. We're not talking about some obscure figure nobody's heard of. We're talking about someone who had a Peace Prize nomination withdrawn nearly a decade ago, specifically because of extremist social media posts. That information was publicly available. It was reported in media at the time. Someone, somewhere in the vast machinery of the British government, should have flagged this before the Prime Minister went public with his delight someone's arrived in Britain. That's a failure of such magnitude that it demands accountability. Otherwise, what's to stop it happening again? The timing could be worse either. We're in the middle of rising tensions around anti-Semitism, increasing polarization on immigration and identity issues, and a general sense that the government isn't taking concerns about extremism seriously enough. And then Starmer walks right into this. It plays into every narrative his critics have been pushing, that he's more concerned about appearing progressive than protecting British values, that his government is incompetent at basic governance, that there's a double standard when it comes to different forms of hatred. Fair or not, that's how it's being perceived, and perception matters in politics. What makes this especially embarrassing is that it was entirely avoidable. If someone had done their job properly, Starmer could have welcomed Abd El-Fattah's release while condemning his past statements and called on him to renounce those views as a condition of settling into British society. That would have been the balanced approach.